What he did to her for bullying him will make you cry. Guys, this is really surprising. Let's find out how it happened. The movie opens with a young, handsome boy named Ernest, seen hustling on the streets, washing cars just to make ends meet. Next, we meet Ruby, a beautiful young girl, driving around in her car and taking pictures of the environment. The following day, Ruby was seen recording a TikTok video as an aspiring influencer, but she felt discouraged because she had very few followers, no likes, and no engagement on any of her posts, even after traveling to London for content. Her mother encouraged her to be patient and keep pushing. Just as she was about to leave, her mother mentioned that her cousins, Natasha and Ife, would be coming for the holidays. Ruby was clearly not excited and called them gold diggers before walking away, leaving her mother shocked and speechless. That night, Ernest returned home from his street hustle and handed his stepmother the little he made, just 2,500 naira. But instead of appreciating his effort, she rejected the money, saying it wasn't enough, and chased him away to go find the balance. The next day, as Ernest walked down the street, some hoodlums called out to him, inviting him to join them at the club. But Ernest refused, and instead advised them to do something meaningful with their lives before walking away to continue his hustle. One fateful day, Ruby's father, the chancellor, was in a business meeting with a man and his son, Luke, who had come to present a proposal. Ruby entered, greeted them, and her father introduced her. Luke's father did the same. But immediately, it was clear that the two teens were not attracted to each other. The chancellor asked Ruby to show Luke around, which she did carelessly while they continued their conversation. Outside, Luke and Ruby properly introduced themselves, but Ruby was rude and proud in her response before walking away, leaving Luke confused and even more uninterested. Later, after the meeting, Luke's father scolded him harshly for being on his phone instead of trying to win the chancellor's daughter's favor. When Luke resisted, his father slapped him and ordered him to get close to Ruby, using any modern Gen Z style, so she could influence her father to give them the contract. Otherwise, Luke would lose his education since his father was spending millions on his tuition. Helpless, Luke had no choice. The next day, Ruby stood by the roadside waiting for her driver. Ernest approached, offering to wash her car to earn some change. But Ruby was irritated by his appearance and treated him with hostility, chasing him away. Ernest walked off, confused why she spoke to him that way on their very first meeting. That night, Ernest tried to rest, but his stepmother woke him aggressively and forced him to wash her clothes, ignoring how tired he was. She maltreated him simply because he wasn't her biological child, which was truly heartbreaking. Days later, Ruby was sitting in the living room pressing her phone when her cousins Natasha and Ife arrived. They greeted her warmly, but she snubbed them and walked away uninterested, leaving them confused. They encouraged each other quietly and carried their bags to their rooms. One night, a group of hoodlums attacked a woman driving alone, intending to rob and assault her. Just then, Ernest appeared from the bushes and bravely fought them off. Though they injured him badly, he saved the woman, who gratefully rushed him into her car and drove him away. The next morning, Ernest regained consciousness in the hospital. To his surprise, the woman he had rescued turned out to be Ruby's mother. Ernest immediately wanted to leave, fearing his stepmother's reaction, though he didn't mention it. But Mrs. Lola pleaded with him to stay and recover fully, and he agreed. Meanwhile, the chancellor, paranoid about the attack on his wife, called the police and ordered them to bring the hoodlums to justice. Shortly after, Natasha and Ife tried again to bond with Ruby, but she rudely ignored them. They wondered why she had grown so arrogant and proud, but since their uncle paid their university tuition, they had no choice but to endure her behavior. Back at Ernest's home, his stepmother fumed that he had not returned for days and swore he would never step foot in her house again. But when Mrs. Lola later arrived with Ernest, his stepmother's attitude flipped. She suddenly acted nice and concerned, simply because Ernest was with a wealthy-looking woman. Mrs. Lola thanked her for raising such a brave boy and promised to always support their family. But the moment she left, the woman dropped her pretense, demanded Ernest's money, and even ordered him to sweep the compound before going inside. One day, Luke drove Ruby out, still trying to woo her, but she treated it like a game. On their way back, they spotted Ernest washing cars. Luke immediately picked a fight, calling him a thief and a hoodlum, just to impress Ruby. But when Ernest fought back and beat him, Ruby still sided with Luke, blaming Ernest as they drove away. That night, Ernest was eating outside when his stepmother stormed in, seized his food, and ordered him to contact Mrs. Lawler for money and food, threatening that he would never eat in her house again. Such cruelty was inhumane, coming from someone supposed to be a mother. The following day, Luke's father continued threatening him to hurry up and secure Ruby's attention, reminding him that without her influence, there would be no contract and no school to return to. The next day, the Chancellor and his family were having breakfast at the dining table when Natasha and Ife began talking about their grades and how well they were doing in school. They also expressed their gratitude to him for supporting them through their education. Hearing this, Ruby felt offended and embarrassed. She abruptly left the table, and her mother quickly followed her to her room to check on her. Ruby, upset, complained that her father never appreciated her, but always saw her as a disappointment, while praising her cousins instead. Her mother apologized and still encouraged her not to compare herself with anyone. But Ruby insisted that her cousins should leave the house. Ife overheard the conversation and rushed to Natasha to share the news. Together, they decided to win Ruby's acceptance by praising her and highlighting her good qualities instead of her shortcomings. They needed financial help from her father and couldn't risk leaving without Ruby's support. That was the real reason they came for the holiday. Hours later, they went to Ruby's room, all smiles. But Ruby angrily and rudely chased them out. Patiently, they began to sing her praises, telling her how inspiring she was to them. Even though she wasn't in school like them, they still admired her and wanted to be like her. Ruby was touched by their kind words. Her heart softened, and she welcomed them happily. The three cousins hugged warmly. One fateful night, Ernest's stepmother threw him out of the house because he had refused to contact Mrs. Lola, the woman he had rescued, to provide food for them. Helpless and devastated, Ernest left. The following day, one of Ernest's colleagues scolded him for taking so much abuse from his stepmother, giving her all his earnings just to stay in her good books, yet never being truly welcomed. Ernest explained that since their father died when they were very young, he automatically became the man of the house, so he had no choice but to endure it. But his colleague shook his head, unconvinced, and walked away. Days later, Ernest was seen at Mrs. Lawler's house. She had called him herself since he never contacted her. Curious about him, she asked what he did for a living, and when he told her, she was displeased. She offered him a job in her home with a salary of 80,000 naira. Ernest was overjoyed and deeply grateful. He thanked her, then went to pack his things as instructed to move in with them. Later that day, after a quarrel with Luke during their outing, Ruby returned home. To her shock, she saw the same young man she and her boyfriend had once bullied, now sitting at her dining table and eating with her cousins. Furious, she immediately asked him to leave, but her mother stepped in, explaining that he was their guest, the one who had saved her life, and that he would now be working for her. Ruby was left speechless, shocked, and embarrassed. The next day, Ruby confided in Ife, telling her she planned to have Ernest sent away by informing her father, since he was unaware of Ernest's presence in the house. His presence disturbed and irritated her. Ife was speechless, but couldn't change Ruby's mind. A few hours later, the Chancellor returned home, and all three girls ran to welcome him. Ruby seized the moment to complain about Ernest, convincing her father to chase him away. When the Chancellor went to Ernest's room, he calmly ordered him to leave because his daughter wasn't comfortable with him. Unexpectedly, Ernest simply replied, "Okay, sir," without arguing or begging. He walked out quietly, leaving Ruby confused by his composure and the fierce look he gave her. Back in the living room, Mrs. Lola refused to let Ernest leave. She reminded her husband that she owed Ernest her life, and the least she could do was give him a job and a roof over his head. She apologized to her husband before leaving. Meanwhile, in her room, Ruby couldn't get over Ernest's reaction. His calmness replayed in her mind, and she felt humiliated. Anger consumed her as she began plotting to ruin his life. The next day, Luke was waiting for Ruby in the living room when Ife came out and introduced herself. Learning Ruby was out with her father, Luke asked Ife to keep him company, and she gladly accepted. Later, Ruby and her father returned. Ruby dramatically covered her nose, claiming Ernest stank. Her father advised Ernest to get deodorant before going inside, leaving Ernest puzzled since he didn't smell. Inside, Luke and Ife welcomed the Chancellor before Luke excused himself. When Ruby entered, she was shocked to see the two of them together. Instead of hiding her feelings, she rudely humiliated them before storming to her room, leaving them both amused. The next day, Ernest was outside washing the car when Ruby came to him, threw money at him, and told him to buy her gum after he ignored her the first time. Ernest didn't say a word and continued working. From upstairs, Ruby watched him closely. She saw how calm, quiet, and unbothered he was. He didn't even pick up the money from the floor and simply continued washing. Later, while her parents were having a meal, Ruby came in and requested a bodyguard for her safety as the Chancellor's daughter, so what happened to her mother wouldn't happen to her. Her father immediately agreed, but her mother opposed, saying it was unnecessary since Ruby didn't go out at night. Ruby insisted, however, that she wanted Ernest as her bodyguard since he was already on the payroll. Her father approved at once, leaving her mother to wonder. The following day, Natasha playfully asked Ruby why she hated Ernest, teasing that she might actually like him. Ruby was offended, humiliated by the suggestion, and angrily chased her out, saying she was too high and mighty to ever associate with a pauper who thought too highly of himself. The next day, while strolling with Ernest walking behind her, Ruby ordered him to lace her shoes just to humiliate him. Ernest ignored her and walked on, leaving her frustrated. Later, at the grocery store, she deliberately made him carry an excessive number of items, knowing he could barely manage, just to be cruel. Yet Ernest never complained and did his job silently. That night, Ernest visited home. His stepsister welcomed him warmly, but his stepmother turned hostile as usual. Ernest quietly gave her a share of his allowance, but she rejected it, throwing it back at him and demanding he request proper compensation instead of working like a servant in someone else's house. Ernest was frustrated and helpless, not knowing how else to please her. But guys, what do you think about this stepmother? Is she going too far, or does she actually believe she's working for the betterment of the family? Let's know your thoughts in the comments section. The next day, Ruby stormed out, screaming Ernest's name and searching everywhere for him. When he finally appeared, she lashed out, insulting him loudly. When he tried to walk away, she dragged him back and raised her hand to slap him, simply because he was looking at her. Instantly, Ernest grabbed her hand and pinned her against the car. Ruby screamed for help, and at that moment, her father rushed out and jumped on Ernest, almost suffocating him to death, until Mrs. Lola intervened and stopped the chaos. Ruby, already feeling guilty, broke down in tears and ran inside when asked what happened, unable to explain herself. Her father, without seeking the truth, blamed Ernest and walked away. Mrs. Lola was left confused, while Ernest tried to recover from the assault. Later that night, Ernest was in his room when Ruby came in, feeling guilty. She sincerely apologized to him, but Ernest remained silent and simply went to bed. Ruby left remorseful. The next day, Ruby tried explaining to her father that she was at fault, that Ernest never did anything to her, but her father refused to believe her, saying she only had a good heart and was covering for him. He insisted Ernest must leave. Just then, Mrs. Lola entered and urged him to check the CCTV footage. He reluctantly agreed. In tears, Ruby apologized to her mother, but her mother, disappointed and embarrassed by her attitude, expressed her disapproval before walking away, leaving Ruby drowning in guilt. The next day, the Chancellor met Ernest on his way out. He sincerely apologized for jumping to conclusions and handed him a small token as compensation. Ernest accepted graciously and returned to work. Later, in the living room, Ife and Natasha, concerned, advised Ruby to fix the damage she had caused with Ernest. Overwhelmed, Ruby excused herself to clear her mind. As soon as she left, Natasha and Ife began gossiping, mocking Ruby as a spoiled, rude, arrogant rich kid with no brains. So sad for her. That same day, Ruby brought some pain relief medicine to Ernest in his room, but he brushed her off and sent her away, even while she was still apologizing. The following day, Ernest was in the kitchen enjoying his meal when Ruby walked in. At first, he ignored her presence, but when she brought water for him, he simply got up and walked away, leaving her feeling rejected. Later, she knocked at his door, but he shut it in her face. All her attempts to make peace with Ernest seemed pointless. One day, she even tried assisting him while he washed the car, but he kept splashing water on her, deliberately forcing her to leave him alone. Honestly, this silent treatment was far more painful and frustrating than confrontation. The next day, Ruby secretly dropped some clothes in Ernest's room, but he threw them all away. She felt more devastated than ever. One fateful day, while Ernest was watering the flowers, Ruby brought juice for him and the other workers outside. To her surprise, Ernest accepted the drink. She was overjoyed, but her happiness quickly turned to sadness when Ernest poured the juice away in front of her. Days later, Natasha thanked Mrs. Lola and requested permission to support underprivileged children in the community for her upcoming birthday, her own way of giving back to society. Shortly after, Ernest came in to inform Mrs. Lola that he was done with work for the day and requested to leave. She decided to check on his tasks, but as he turned to go, Natasha called him back and asked for his help with her project. Ernest agreed. Hours later, Ruby asked the gateman about Ernest's whereabouts, but he didn't know. As she turned to leave, she heard laughter. Looking around, she saw Ernest and Natasha talking and laughing together like close friends. Ruby was disappointed and walked away when Natasha greeted her. Ernest excused himself and went back to work while Natasha returned inside. At the dining table, the three girls were eating when Natasha began singing Ernest's praises, calling him a cool guy. Ruby felt offended at first, but when she heard about Natasha's project and Ernest taking her to the market, she insisted on joining them, leaving Natasha and Ife shocked. The next day, Ernest was waiting outside when Natasha and Ruby came out. He ignored Ruby and continued with the journey. At the bus stop, they waited nearly 30 minutes but couldn't get a tricycle to take them to the market. Natasha suggested Ruby return home so she and Ernest could walk, but Ruby refused, insisting she would walk with them just so Ernest would notice her. Hours later, Ruby was exhausted from the long walk to the market, and even Natasha was tired. Ernest tried convincing Ruby to call her driver, but she still refused, determined to stick it out. Finally, they arrived home, completely drained. When Mrs. Lola asked how far the market was, she revealed the shocking truth. The market was actually very close. The two girls went silent, instantly realizing Ernest had tricked them. The next day, Ruby confronted Ernest while he washed the car, but he showed no remorse, leaving her devastated and frustrated as she walked away. The following day, Ruby brought Ernest some fresh chicken her father had bought from her favorite restaurant. But Ernest rejected it, telling her to give it to her cousins instead because he didn't need it. Hurt, Ruby stormed into her cousin's room, threw the chicken at them, and walked away. Natasha and Ife were stunned. Ruby had never shared her favorite meal with them before. It was still hot and fresh. They even hesitated to eat it, fearing it might be poisoned. The next day, Ruby gifted Ernest another chicken meal, but again, he rejected it. This time, Ruby felt more embarrassed and rejected than ever. She ran to her room, broke down in tears, and wondered whether she should stop trying and just give up on being kind to him. Days later, Ernest, Natasha, and Ruby went for a walk. Natasha spoke about how much she loved giving back to those who had helped her and even to those who had nothing. Ernest commended her kindness, but Ruby, in ignorance, remarked that it was pointless for the poor to give to the poor, that it was better to give to the rich. Her words disgusted Ernest. Right there, he gave her a piece of his mind, calling her a terrible person with no manners, full of pride and ego. Natasha gently agreed, adding that Ruby often reminded people of her so-called kindness, rubbing it in their faces, which wasn't genuine at all. Ernest then bluntly told her she was a bad and disgusting human being. Ruby, crushed by his words, ran off humiliated. Natasha quickly rebuked Ernest for being too harsh before running after Ruby, leaving him alone to reflect on what he had said. Back in her room, Ruby was still crying as her cousins tried to console her. She asked them to honestly tell her the kind of person she really was, promising she wouldn't retaliate or cut off their school fees. They told her bluntly that she was even worse than what Ernest described. Ruby felt ashamed and hated herself, but her cousins reassured her and encouraged her to change into a better person. The following day, Ernest looked worried, not having seen or heard from Ruby. When Ife came out to throw away some trash, Ernest asked about her. Ife told him Ruby hadn't spoken to anyone since that day and hadn't eaten, and she feared Ruby might go mute permanently if nothing was done. Ernest panicked and regretted being so harsh with her. Later, Ife told Ruby what she had told Ernest, explaining that she wanted Ernest to start chasing after Ruby, just like Ruby had chased after him all this time. Together with Natasha, they taught Ruby how to act indifferent when next she saw him. The three spent time together, laughing and bonding. The following day, the three girls were heading to the boutique, but the driver wasn't around, so Ernest offered to drive them, mainly to apologize to Ruby during the ride. Later, Ernest and Ruby were alone in the car. The silence was awkward. Every time Ernest tried to speak, he fumbled and said the wrong thing. Finally, he asked why she hadn't been eating if she didn't like the meals prepared for her. He offered to cook something different, and she agreed. Natasha soon joined them in the car. That evening, Ernest cooked and served Ruby in the kitchen. She thanked him, and when she tasted the food, she loved it. She praised his cooking skills, which made him feel relieved and happy. They chatted and shared a lighthearted moment together. In her room later, Ruby excitedly told her cousins how nice and caring Ernest was, though she feared he was only being kind out of guilt. Natasha and Ife reassured her that Ernest was simply being himself and confirmed what Ruby had been denying all along, that she truly liked him. The three girls enjoyed their cheerful, girly time together. One day, after work, Ernest was heading home when Ruby asked to join him. Surprised, he allowed her. At Ernest's house, it was already dark, so he urged Ruby to leave quickly. His stepmother wasn't home at first, but when she returned, she immediately began insulting Ernest. She accused him of treating them like beggars, since he had refused to collect money from the chancellor's wife and bring it home. She called him useless. Ernest tried to calm her, addressing her as Mom, but she snapped, saying she could never be his mother, that his real mother had abandoned him over 20 years ago. Since he couldn't do the simple thing she asked, she demanded he pack his things and leave her house. Ruby, unable to stand the humiliation Ernest was enduring, stood up for him. She called his stepmother an ungrateful and entitled woman who didn't care how Ernest struggled day and night to put food on the table. Overcome with emotion, Ruby ran off. Ernest rushed after her, while his stepmother remained unconcerned. Ruby, still emotional, confessed that she felt guilty for calling someone entitled when she herself had been guilty of the same thing. Ernest comforted her, commending her bravery for defending him, and he sincerely thanked her. The following day, Ruby surprised her parents with gifts to thank them for being amazing parents, even when she felt she didn't deserve it. Her parents were stunned by her gesture, overjoyed and grateful to God for the sudden change in her. They embraced her warmly, encouraging her to keep it up. Days later, Ernest and Ruby were seen spending fun moments together, doing chores side by side, going out, playing, and creating memories, almost like two people in love. One day, the three girls were making TikTok live videos, having fun, when Ernest playfully photobombed their recording. Soon, all four of them continued with the fun, laughing and smiling. Afterwards, they played a Scrabble game. Even Luke joined in, and together they had a wonderful time, laughing and bonding like one happy family. Days later, Natasha and Ife prepared to return to school. They gratefully thanked the chancellor for all he had done for them. Just then, Ruby joined them and confessed how much she would miss them, promising to visit them at school. The chancellor reminded Natasha and Ife to hurry, as the Uber was waiting. Then Ruby asked why he and her mother had been coming home late recently. He explained that because of a new development at the government house, he preferred to ride home with his wife so the previous incident wouldn't repeat itself. He then excused himself, leaving the three girls to enjoy their last girl time together before Natasha and Ife left. Outside, Ernest bid the cousins goodbye and expressed how much he would miss the fun and energy they brought to the house. Together, they saw them off. Later that day, Mr. Onuch, Luke's father, looked furious and frustrated. The chancellor hadn't given him the contract he had promised. Enraged, he blamed Luke for failing in his plans to win Ruby over. Luke argued that he and Ruby were simply not compatible, then asked why his father hadn't just submitted the proposal directly. Mr. Onuche rebuked him, insisting that since the Chancellor was his best friend and kinsman, that alone should have guaranteed the contract. In desperation, he vowed to deal with the Chancellor for disappointing him before angrily driving off. The following day, Ruby invited Ernest to her room. Nervous at first, he hesitated, but she made him feel at ease. She showed him the TikTok video they had made together, which had now gone viral. She thanked him for helping her grow her page after years of struggling. Suddenly, a silence fell between them as they leaned in, almost kissing, until a phone call interrupted. Flustered, Ernest excused himself and left, while Ruby attended to the caller. It was Luke. Hours later, Luke drove Ruby to a quiet, lonely place, claiming she would love it. Ruby felt uncomfortable at first, but Luke reassured her. Just as she tried to apologize to him for being rude and hostile in the past, armed men jumped out from the bushes and ambushed them. They dragged Ruby to the back and forced Luke to drive them away. Meanwhile, Ernest was rehearsing what to say to Ruby when she returned. Suddenly, he heard Mrs. Lola scream. She had just learned that her daughter had been kidnapped. Ernest was shocked and confused. At the Chancellor's house, panic and tears filled the air. Mrs. Lola was restless and anxious while the Chancellor spoke on the phone with the kidnappers. Tragically, the mastermind behind it all was none other than Luke's father, Mr. Onuche. He demanded that the Chancellor cancel the contract and award it to him, warning him not to involve the police or else he would never see Ruby again. To make matters worse, the contract had already passed to the government, leaving the Chancellor powerless. As Mrs. Lola wept and begged her husband to do something, he suddenly had an idea and rushed out. Later, Ernest approached the same street hoodlums who had once tried to lure him into joining them. Desperate, he explained Ruby's kidnapping and begged them for help. After much pleading and persuasion, they agreed, since they knew every corner of the area. Ernest, grateful, thanked them deeply. That night, Ernest met with the hoodlums again, and they led him to the place where Ruby was held captive. Rushing inside, he found Ruby tied to a chair. Just as he tried to escape with her, one of the kidnappers returned. Ernest told Ruby to run while he stayed behind to fight. Ruby managed to escape, but Ernest was beaten to a pulp. Later, he was rushed unconscious to the hospital, where Ruby sat tearfully at his bedside until he woke up. Her mother joined them, overwhelmed with gratitude, thanking Ernest once again for saving her daughter's life and calling him a godsend to their family. Moments later, the doctor arrived to check on him. Days later, after Ernest was discharged, he joined the Chancellor and his family for breakfast. To show their gratitude, they offered to sponsor his university education, declaring that he was no longer a staff but a part of their family. Overwhelmed, Ernest went on his knees, thanking them with tears in his eyes. The next day, Ernest and Ruby were seen enjoying a tender moment together. Ernest finally professed his love to her, asking if she could wait for him 7 years until he completed his studies, built a career, and was ready to marry her. Ruby joyfully accepted, promising to wait as they cherished their beautiful moment together. 1 year later, Ernest returned from school to visit Ruby. She was overjoyed to see him. They hugged tightly, confessing how much they had missed each other. Ruby, too, was now in school. In each other's arms, they talked about their studies, their lives, and their love. Their bond had only grown stronger, unbreakable, as they held each other close and declared their love once more. So guys, if you enjoyed this movie, kindly subscribe to this channel for more of our latest stories.